I'm going to read you the Gartner definition of cloud, and then I'm going to ask each of these three gentlemen how they define it or how they think about it, and what it is or isn't to them. Just by way of getting us started, because the feeling I got back from some of you was that this is kind of, you're not really exactly sure what it may be. So Gartner's definition is the following. Cloud computing is a style of computing in which scalable and elastic IT-enabled capabilities are delivered as a service to customers using internet technologies. And that's what Gartner has to say about it. Gents, does one of you want to jump in with your thoughts? Maybe Gear, you can start us on this. And
since I actually think it's extremely dangerous to put any definition on it, because I don't think we know what it is yet. So I think actually a definition this early in the game can actually limit us where we will go or where we can go. I think somebody says that, if you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you got there? Well, that is maybe right if you have a predetermined outcome you want to do. But in this instance, I think that by maybe not knowing where we're going is maybe the stronger case. If you go back 30 years ago, when people started kind of playing with the internet, there was no definition of the internet. And you see where that brought us. It brought us very, very far. And I ran a company where one of the founders of the internet was a director, a guy called John Postel, that basically he and Vint Cerf basically were the guys that started it in the first place. And he told me that, where this thing ever took off, they had never fantasized about that when they first started it. So I think we should be very careful with definitions.
I think in that sense, Gartner made a very good job, because that definition is so elastic in itself that you can bend everything into it or out of it.
Make it ambiguous.
I think what's probably much more interesting for you here as students to learn a little bit more what we think about that in the industry is to talk about what we actually do and also what we not do. I mean, so Hans was so kind to share a couple of questions that you raised beforehand for us. And probably I should start with what I do not understand under cloud computing today. So I do not today understand cloud computing as I basically turn the key on my data center and say that was it, and everything else what I'm doing from that point onward is coming out of the cloud. We do actually in Hilti do quite a bit with cloud computing, but that is peripheral additional applications that I do not have to run in my data center. I still have my data centers. I still run SAP in my data centers. I still run Microsoft Office in my data centers. So that will not change in the next few months. That might change over the next 10 or 15 years, very likely in different steps, but that's not reality today. I do not believe that a larger industry company can close the data centers today because of everything is running out of the cloud.
Olivier, what do you say about the definition? How do you define it?
I think the tendency of today's world is to look at the cloud as something outside of the enterprise. And I think it's just a wrong perception. It's not just that, but it can also be inside the enterprise. And we have the private cloud. And today for the large company, the private is more important than the external cloud. For the small and medium companies, probably the reverse. So we have to understand different point of view from that area. We also have to look at it from, it's a knowledge understanding, and we start, for example, with applications that we have ported on the cloud, because they are available there, they're more user-friendly, the mobility behind it is very important. And I think it's a journey where we will learn more and more in terms of what we can port there. If you take, for example, data which are outside of the enterprise, like websites, there's no reason to put that inside the enterprise. You use the cloud, you leverage it, you can absorb peaks, etc. So that's a good way to look at it. And it really depends on what you want to do. So I'm trying not to put a definition behind it for the same reason. Each time we look at a different thing, we look at a different area, and it's really a different domain that we haven't thought about. So it's very hard to put a definition behind it.
So before we go on to what each of you is doing in the cloud in your corporations right now, Olivier, you raised the point of public and private cloud. Would you say a word or two about how those are differentiated in your mind?
Yeah, today we are faced with a certain number of issues when we talk about those new technology. One which is coming to mind is around privacy, and how do we manage those informations that we have on the web, and how, from a security point of view, do we want to manage that? And this is one of the reasons today we are putting some very strong governance around what we do with application, what you need to leave inside the company, what we need to port outside of the company. And clearly, though we have that issue, we want still to leverage the power of the cloud and those technologies. So what we are doing is we are creating internally to the enterprise the mimic of what is happening outside. And what we want to do is to be able then to take application running on the cloud outside and put that inside our company, like that we basically control it. Now, this is more a short-term discussion for the next few years until we feel it's more secure, because at the end of the day, the wall of IT is not around the enterprise. We have to look at the ecosystem, and clearly we cannot limit it to the internal. So we will have to expand it at one point of time. Now, I'm the same views as Martin. Today, we run our IT system on 3 major data centers in the world, and we basically have 1 billion units going out to the supply chain every single day, so you cannot run that on the cloud today. Maybe SAP in 10 to 20 years they will deliver a solution for that, but today we are not yet there.
I think, but certainly a very intelligent way to look at it, to use basically cloud technology internally to basically leverage that in areas where currently cloud offerings are not available. And we try to do the same thing for many years. Actually, we're obviously now pushed a little bit further on the technology side by what's happening in the cloud. But for me, nevertheless, when I talk cloud computing, or true cloud computing, as I would call it now, that is really the public cloud and not the internal stuff. I think the internal stuff, to a degree, that's a little bit so label optimization, because at the end of the day, I mean, we run data centers with consolidated services for a very long time without that we ever called that private cloud computing before. I think now we put the label cloud computing on it because it sounds a little bit more up to snuff. But at the end of the day, true cloud computing for me is really that I actually purchase complete IT services from somebody providing that in an elastic, scalable manner, as I learned from Gartner. So actually in a very cost-effective and time-effective manner. That is how I look at that.
One of the good way to look at it is a utility service. Today you don't have a power plant behind your house. You just plug in to get utility. I think IT will move there. And some companies are more advanced than others in that area, but I think that's a good image for me on what the cloud approach is.
Why are we excited about the cloud? Well, it really is because you can tap into somebody else's economy of scale. So that you can take the economy of scale of running an application or an environment on a very large scale, and I can tap into that quickly and have a consumption-based pricing on it. I mean, that is fantastic. I mean, we've looked at that for years to find that.
The other example where we leverage the cloud is really on the what we call point of sales data. Each time you go in a store, all the data which is captured by the local store, you can get that data. The problem is, with the number of consumers that you have, it's a huge amount of data, and you don't want to bring that into the company. What you do, you leave that outside, you summarize it, and you work at it from outside, and you only bring the data you need to basically do the analytics with your own data that you have stored internally, and bridging the two together. Linked to that, one area which is coming very, very strongly is around the social data that we are getting from the web, all the sentiment analysis that we can get from a social point of view, which is also interesting. The last example that we are using the software as a service, which is part of this definition of the cloud, where we buy a solution for the HR area, which is basically in the area of development guides and performance management. We have 300,000 employees in the group, and probably we have today about 200,000 which are using that solution. And you can imagine you do that probably twice a year. And basically during two periods during the year, you need to allow people to get into the system for a period of an hour. And they are basically all working at the same time. So clearly we need to give a different infrastructure to support that organization. So those are three examples which give you a bit of a flavor of what we are using on the web.
So Geert, I mean, you have a very different nature business in terms of large project nature, partners, many partners that you have to work with, some of whom you sometimes are partnering with on one project and competing with on another. How does the cloud play into that for you?
It's true. It's a mess. Because what we have is that we have projects where we have the customers are part of the project, our supply chain, Hilti too, sometimes even, are part of that vendor supply side of it. And then we have partners, as you mentioned, our competitors, where we have a joint venture with one of the competitors to deliver whatever it is. And in the past, what we did was that we took these other third parties and we invited them in as guests to our network. So they actually came in and they got an account with us and they used our tools for this stuff. And I tell you, it doesn't make for good night's sleep, when you have your competitors actually sitting inside your network playing with you, or playing with the data, and so on. So we kind of said, well, maybe we had to think about this differently. So the cloud kind of, as it came in, was one of the saviors of that, and where we actually throw everybody outside. And then you just say, now, we will invite you in for the piece that you need to do, and therefore, if we want to have you come in on a kind of like a on-demand basis, well, then we have to look the same as the service providers that are out there in the cloud base. So we have to look the same as any of these other ones, which means you have to kind of solve the authentication issues and authorization issues and so on all around the security of the data. But if you change that to a level where you say, now my security is going to be based on policies rather than topology. So we've used this analogy time after time, but it's kind of like the old IT world was like a European medieval castle with a moat around it and big walls, and you have a drawbridge that's called a firewall. And you come in and then we do it. That's not how we live in our project world. We live in metropolitan cities. We live in highly complex metropolitan areas, and therefore we need to base it on policies, not on the topology around it, so that when we have a partner and they come in and they say, well, I don't want to have a Bechtel ID, well, fine, use your Google ID, use your Facebook ID. We don't care, because we will authenticate you however you feel you should be authenticated, and then we will approve you to go in and do the work you need to do in accordance with who you say you are and who we deem you are, and so on. And that has really turned our work upside down, because now you say, well, our applications were really not written for that.
Here you raised security as an issue in your thinking here. And Olivier, Martin, both of you have talked at various points about privacy issues in Europe and so on. So can we talk a little bit about what some of the issues might be, some of the risks might be with cloud computing, and what are some of the things that run through your mind, and maybe the trade-offs that you make, or the issues that governments cause you and how they approach things, et cetera?
I think there's one big problem, and that is the legal framework, especially in Europe, regarding cloud computing or overall data protection and data processing, that puts clear limits on the utilization of cloud today. And that's unfortunate, because at the end of the day, I believe these laws must be 20, 25 years old, and that do not reflect today's reality. And we need to deal with these laws now. We cannot, as CIOs responsible in Europe for European business, we cannot ignore them, But the reality is, unfortunately, that means we need to slow down the deployment of today's technology in our companies, especially in that area of cloud computing. And I think that's very unfortunate, and I hope that we improve that situation, that the legal framework in Europe improves significantly over the next years. And I hope that the hype and the pressure behind cloud helps in that regard. On the other hand side, when we talk about security, clearly we need new security paradigms when we deal here with cloud type of infrastructure, but we also need to communicate clearly that cloud does not mean, also public cloud does not mean public data. That is two different things. And there is sometimes a big myth around cloud being unsecure and only data that's not so important here, like my videos I mentioned earlier, can be put in the cloud. That's not the reality, also not today. You mentioned that you put people performance data in the cloud very successfully because it's simply an area that's asking for that with the peak demand and so on. We do exactly the same thing. And we don't do that because we believe that that is then public data, but we do believe that the partners we choose are as responsible dealing with that data as we would do in our data centers. And only that then gives way to that we use these type of services. But I think there's a lot in the legal framework. There needs to be a lot needs to be done here from the government side to improve the situation, especially in Europe. On the security side, I think it is more our job here to also improve clarity in our teams, in our management teams, to be more clear on what is secure and unsecure in the cloud and what makes sense and not makes sense in the cloud.
Yeah, I was talking about the governance before, and I think this is, for us, an important element because it brings a transparency of what we are doing and the way we want to handle the issues that we are facing or the potential problems that we may face in terms of privacy, in terms of what is required in every different country, being it in Europe or in Asia, probably less here in the US. And what we are trying here is to make sure that when people make that kind of decision, they understand what it takes and what are the risks the risks that they are taking. And one of the areas is privacy and that kind of issues. The other area is also depending on the suppliers that we are working with, and we have to also understand, what is the risk factor linked to that supplier from a size point of view, reputation point of view, and clearly we need to make sure that our data doesn't fall on the end of the outside world, because at the end of the day, the supplier will not be responsible. We will be responsible to let go of that information in the cloud. So we have to make sure that we deliver that kind of level of satisfaction at the end of the day to our business people.
Martin mentioned legal, and I think that you have the statutory legal side that has to grow up and follow what we're doing. But I also think internally we have to change our legal structure, basically being our own policies.
Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask? Start up here.
Thanks for coming to talk.
Turn on your mic.
Thanks for coming to talk. Just a quick question. The actual, physical movement of data from your servers to the cloud is very simple, but the design and heavy lifting could be quite complex, and that's where the real value is. Are you leveraging more folks internal, consultants, or the actual providers of this service to help you design and come up with best practices? And how do you see that changing in the future?
You need both, obviously. I mean, you need the external guys telling their infrastructure and the requirements they have. And unfortunately, that is not extremely standardized across services provided from different providers. And you need, obviously, your own people in order to make use out of that. And by the way, you just mentioned a very interesting point, which I also would like to highlight here. I mean, it's one thing to get the data into the cloud. The other thing is to change a provider or to get it out again. And that is actually the much more complex process, where also the collaboration actually seems to be not on the same level as when you get it into the cloud, for obvious reasons.
In the old world, they made barriers to entry. Now they make barriers to exit. And this is a big, you're unhappy with a provider and you want to change, it might become very, very complicated. In that old world pre-cloud, the number of vendors was starting to get few and large, And therefore, actually, the way that actually we as users of it, we had some kind of influence on what was going on. As you go into cloud, it will be a very distributed, very immature environment that will have a lot of change going on, and we have to be willing to accept that change in a very different way than we had in the more stable environment prior to the cloud. I mean, these takeovers of these smaller service providers and the forced changes that are going on, we had the same thing where we had no solution afterwards, and we had to get the data back and then work with it. And the new company here being bought, this data I want out, this company says, yeah, but you have to pay for it. Well, wait a moment, it's my data. Yeah, but we're going to process it, so you have to pay for it. And it was not a small ticket it started with. It ended up in an amicable way. But those are things that we have to learn how to contract for it. We have to learn how to procure it and procure and contract. And we have to learn how to kind of accept a very different risk, an operational risk that we didn't have before.
And by the way, it's also a new job in the IT departments, because all of a sudden what you do is you architect your cloud environment. While in the past we were probably more providing technology or had specialists in certain applications, and now it is more that you architect your IT environment, composing cloud services or getting ready to use cloud services in the first place. And that's definitely a huge job for the IT departments of the future.
We went from a very centralized computing. You talked about the mainframe and the AS400 and so on. What did we do? We solved departmental issues. We solved the order taking. We solved payroll. We solved manufacturing. Then you went from that to a decentralized, and we started solving the enterprise problem. So we had end-to-end processes. So we took an order to pay and that kind of stuff. So we went broader and we decentralized our systems, and we went from hierarchical databases to SQL databases because we needed to relate the data, and we kind of put the whole thing together. We went from then the decentral to a universal or a global approach, where actually we are solving the value chain issues. We're solving them on such a broad base that we know that we will never be able to have control and standards that will follow the whole thing. Therefore, we go to NoSQL databases because we say we have to figure out how the data can be related in a different way than having it in a normalized table like what SQL will do for you. So we go to that kind of say, well, then you say suddenly all of this is now consumerized, because now I am expecting the users to come from any place, anywhere, anytime, with any form of technology. So we need to have that strategy of kind of like, how do we go between these ones? And by the way, any of these three are not uniquely separated. They actually are building on each other. You will find, like what Martin said, for many of the people that in the core, they still have mainframes. IBM is still making a lot of money selling mainframe equipment. It's just like it's not what hits your front page, but it is really big, and it's very, we happen to have killed ours. We killed it in the Y2K, but the thing is, we still run, in a way, mainframe activities. They just happen to run on blades and virtualized servers, but it's, what we do is kind of the same. So if you do not have a strategy that goes out there, I think that you could very quickly be left behind.
Well, clearly, like my other colleagues, we have a strategy moving there. You can look back at the cycle of innovation in IT, and that cycle is basically going smaller or faster and faster. And basically, you have to adjust every 5 to 6 years now. And today, as part of our strategy moving forward, we are already looking at implementing by the end of the year an enterprise app store, and that we can deliver functionality on application, on small apps, basically to our end users. And that's basically the world is looking at today, and we are forced to move in that direction, which is the right approach for the user from a usability point of view. And I think those apps are very important in that view. And clearly behind it, you have all the infrastructure which need to follow. And it started already a couple of years through virtualization of servers and basically going into up to basically being able to deliver cloud-type applications.
So my question is on the role of the CIO and how it has changed, given, if at all, given the major shifts in technology and the rapid change in innovation, and how do you expect it to change? Perhaps even what makes a successful CIO and job characteristics, even the function itself.
Olivier, you want to start?
I think if you want to simplify that, it went from somebody in charge of the technology and making sure it's delivering value every single day to somebody which is working closer to the business to drive innovation and to basically help the business to drive their own plan in terms of value to the business. So that's the major change, the major shifts that you can see today.
But that's not really new, no, because that's at the end for decades, and it is now a little bit more pronounced because it is getting even closer to the business, as you mentioned.
I think we will be released, as they said, to closer to the business. And the plumbing side of our business that we have spent a lot of time on in the past, I think we will be much more of a broker or aggregator of those services. And those services might either be in-house performed or not out-house performed, but performed outside. So you're either self-performing or somebody else is performing it, and you have to figure out how to aggregate that to find a solution for the business, but also how to bring that information together in a meaningful way. Because, you know, in the end of the day, that is the value is in that information of how that helps us do business, hopefully better. And we have to be careful there that we don't fragment it again.
Well, I think that's unfortunately at the end of our time. So Olivier, Martin, Geir, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. Been a wonderful discussion, and I learned some things that are new too, so that's wonderful. I hope you learned
Thank
something too. Thank you.